edition of the platform is Mr. Roman Oseghale. He holds a master's degree in architecture and he's a graduate of the Telford School of Management and Center for Executive Leadership in University of Ottawa, Canada, where he obtained a master's degree in business administration and an MBA from the Executive MBA program. He's an architect, consultant, and business analyst. He's presently the head consultant at IntelServe, a Canadian consulting company, which he founded to provide business reengineering services, business intelligence, and analysis. He has consulted for notable Canadian companies, helping diagnose problems and preferring appropriate solutions for growth and profitability. He currently lives and works in Canada, and today at the platform, he is speaking on a topic, developing sustainable economic growth. Please join me as we welcome Mr. Roman Oseghale.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm going to be talking about a very sensitive issue, and I would implore everyone to please listen attentively because we're going to be walking and I'll be explaining things along timelines. But before I start, I want to really thank Pastor Pojo Imade for giving me the opportunity and telling me to come down to come give this talk. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, developing a sustainable economic growth ensures both economic and political stability in any country. It is the gateway to creating wealth and the basis of confidence in any economy, and what prevents the devastating and inefficient impact of corporate premature failure and death. No, I have. Okay. So what do? We carry out business analysis of organizations by using survey analysis and business intelligence tools and models. We are able to trace back the cause of every challenge using both qualitative and quantitative data. We match this data with timelines to know where an organization either took the wrong decision, followed the wrong turn, or where market forces changed demand and which now affects growth and profitability. And at the same time, comparing this data to both market and industry standards. In the case of Nigeria, what we did was to take Nigeria back 57 years, analyzing data from 1960 to present day, and comparing this data to those of 80 other countries from 6 continents. There was a time Nigeria had a sustainable economic progress. So what were we doing right? And at what point did we take the wrong turn? Matching this data with those of other countries revealed what we did right and how Nigeria was ahead of some of these countries in per capita income when we did these things. Data also shows that as soon as we stopped, our per capita income started dropping. And the amazing thing is that as soon as these other countries started doing what we were doing in the past, their per capita income started increasing, surpassing that of Nigeria, and putting their economy on the path of sustainable growth. So, to develop a sustainable economic growth, we must look at the factors that drive generic or organic growth in an economy and the agencies and institutions that help sustain such growth. Now, these agencies and institutions are service providers. If they do not exist or their services do not meet the standard required by the country, people will seek for them elsewhere. And as they seek for them outside the country, they take forex with them, putting a strain on the economy. These factors include innovation, manufacturing, and productivity. These are the factors that create generic growth in an economy. While the agencies and institutions that help retain this growth are education, healthcare, aviation, security, tourism, and marine services. So what are the roles of this institution? Private sector and foreign investors need certainty. For growth to happen, government must ensure functioning courts, institutions that are well and functioning, and must protect property rights. The current fight to reduce corruption is therefore key. So, in 1945, the United Nations was formed or constituted. And two principal organs of the United Nations were also formed in 1945 and 1948, namely UNESCO and the World Health Organization. And economists had sat down and said, look, for you to be able to achieve sustainable growth in any economy, a developing country must put in 26% of their budget into education. That is investing in education, or 5% of your GDP. And you must be able to invest 15% of your budget in health. So, why education and health? Education ensures that a child moves out of poverty. The first thing that happens is when you educate a child, right, they move to a higher level. And then their productivity increases. Innovation comes in. Health ensures that a child utilizes his or her maximum capacity. And as the maximum capacity is utilized, a country is able to benefit economically from capacity utilization. There's no need sending a child to Harvard, paying $500,000, right? While that child will be in and out of hospital like 150 days in a year. So, what the research shows is that there is a direct correlation between education expenditure and per capita income. What I've done in this research is I have broken this thing down to the barest minimal, so that even if you are not an economist or you do not understand economic terms, you will be able to understand what I'm going to be explaining. And as per capita income increases, right, GDP ultimately increases. This is the model of the Western world. They concentrate on individuals, educate an individual, and give them the necessary skills. And as the individuals make a better per capita income, it ultimately increases the GDP. So let us look at beyond GDP and mineral resources. Our economy is a mineral resource economy, right? Now, let us look at Africa. God, in his infinite mercy, blessed Africa so much. 1/3. We have six continents, right? And Africa is the richest by mineral resources. 1/3, that is 33.3% of all Earth's mineral resources, is buried in Africa. 2/3, 66% of all mined diamonds comes from Africa. 10%, that is 1/10 of all global oil reserve lies in Africa. 75% of all cocoa products, or cocoa beans rather, come from Africa. And Africa is home to some of the rarest mineral resources. But yet, Africa is the poorest in per capita income. So why? We're the richest in mineral resources, but the poorest in per capita income. We're going to find out why. Now, but it will also interest you that the cocoa industry, right, is worth $100 billion worldwide. But Africa produces 75% of the cocoa beans. And Africa's share is just 2 billion, 2%. 2%. The Netherlands, that does not grow cocoa, processes 13% of all cocoa beans worldwide. Europe and Russia, that do not grow cocoa, processes 38% of all cocoa beans worldwide. Cocoa has tens of products. While we export cocoa beans, these tens of products are brought back to Africa to be sold. So, unlike in the past, the knowledge economy has always been important. But it is the main drivers of the economic growth of the 21st century. Without the best of education, a country is heading nowhere in terms of sustainable economic growth. Knowledge-based economy is therefore key. Education is an economic model for growth and sustainability. We have to move to a knowledge-based economy. It is the main driver and brains behind innovation. It is the brains behind manufacturing and the brains behind the management of productivity. We cannot continue to build our future on mineral resources. It is not the true wealth of a nation. All the progressive countries are operating a knowledge-based economy. Research shows that there is no country that has ever grown there is no country that has ever grown without massive investment in human capital development. So, what is human capital development? Let us take the definition. It says it is the collective skills, knowledge, or other intangible assets of individuals that can be used to create economic value for the individual, their employers, or their community. Community here could be seen as a country. Education is an investment in human capital that pays off in terms of what? Higher productivity. But this is the interesting thing. Now, low-income countries account for 37% of world population, 11% of world GDP, but we account for less than 1% of all US registered patents taken out by investors in year 2000. The top 20 countries in patenting, all high-income countries, account for 98% of all patents. Now you see why we export cocoa beans, right? And they bring in tens of products back that are patented, we cannot copy or we cannot duplicate, but we end up buying. They are also the largest investors in what? In education. So we are going to see where the problem is. What we basically do as a company is this. If you have issues, right, we come to you, we look at your processes, we look at the deficiencies, we look at the gaps. We are able to identify these factors, right, by working backwards. We look at your finances, cost control, operations, sales and marketing. And by the time we walk backwards some years into your operations, we are able to detect what the problem is and where you took the wrong turn. So in the case of Nigeria, what I simply did was to take Nigeria back 57 years, right from 1960. In the 60s, it was good, right? In the 70s, it was good. So what were we doing at those periods? And where did we go wrong? So, if you look at the net or adjusted net savings of a country, right? Net national savings plus education expenditure, is equals to net national savings plus education expenditure depletion minus damage from carbon dioxide emission minus damage from particulate emission. What does it tell us? Every mineral resources you have, right, is on the minus. For instance, if you have 500 million barrels of crude buried underground, right, by the time you start extracting it, next year you cannot sell that oil well for the same price. But the difference in education is this. Whatever you put in a child, whatever you put in an individual, right, that investment increases the value of that person. And that person's worth is increased. This is the value that the Western world, Europe, North America, right, and the Asian countries have now adopted. But the interesting thing that you will see through data is why our economy was progressing in the 60s and 70s, what we were doing. Now, we conducted the research using data from 80 countries, countries from 6 continents, narrowed down to about 3 countries per continent. All 80 countries proved our hypothesis correct. Asia and Africa were serious case study for Nigeria. Why? Because some of the countries that have overtaken us today, we were ahead of them in the 60s and 70s. And then when we matched this data, everything became clear what we were doing wrong. Nigeria was ahead in per capita income compared to some Asian and African countries in the early 80s. And these countries are ahead of us today. So, this is our GDP. As I said, I'm taking the country back 57 years to 1960. In 1960, our GDP was 4.2 billion. By 1970, it had increased to 12.6 billion. And by 1981, it had increased to 61.1 billion. By 2014, it had increased to 569 billion. Now, the next slide shows our education expenditure. In 1970, right, we had an education expenditure of $185.7 million with a population of 56 million people. And that $185.7 million represented 1.47% of the budget. Remember, the UN says what? 5% of your what? Your GDP. Or 26% of your budget. This figure represented 1.47% of our GDP, rather, not budget. By 1981, if you look at the graph, right, we had started increasing the education budget. The education budget had started going up. We started conforming with what UN was saying, right? And by 1981, we had reached 3 billion, representing 4.9%, approximately what? 5%. And by 1981, we had a population of 75 million people. But the interesting thing was to happen. From 1982, education expenditure started reducing. And by 1986, with a population of 86.1 million people, education budget had reduced to less than $1 billion. And that year, it was 608 million, representing 2.9%. And then it stayed below $1 billion for 20 years. It wasn't until 2006 that education expenditure on the federal level went above $1 billion for the first time in 20 years. By 2006, we had hit a population of 145 million people. And education expenditure was 1.19 billion, representing 0.8% of the GDP. By 2011, 30 years after, education expenditure went back to what it was in 1981. You know why I'm saying this? What is the wealth of a nation? What is the wealth of a nation? It is the people. The people are the wealth of a nation. But the reverse is what we are practicing in Africa. We believe that the mineral resources is our wealth, right? The Western world believes that the wealth of a nation is what? Is the people. And that's why they invest in human capital development. Your mineral resources will continue to be depleted, but people will continue to what? Increase. Now, by 2011, the education expenditure or investment represented 0.8% at 3.3 billion of GDP, right? Now, the interesting thing is this. The 3 billion we had in 1981 was 4.9%, right? But the 3 billion we had in 2011 was 0.8%. In fact, from 1981 or 1982, when it started dropping, it reached an all-time low in 1991 of 0.77%. And it had remained at 0.8% ever since. The truth is, we are the investment of the country, but the government is not investing in us. And that's where the real problem is. By 2014, at 177.5 million people, education expenditure was 4.6 billion, still representing 0.8%. While we may think it's an increase, right, from 1981, it's actually not an increase because it's now catering for more people. So in 33 years, population increased by 134%. Education expenditure only increased by 1.6 billion and representing 53.7%. But this is the interesting thing. Let's go to the next slide. Now, if you look at this slide, right, in 1960, our per capita income was 93. By 1970, it had increased to 224. By 1980, 871. And by 1981, 807. As we were increasing education expenditure, our per capita income was increasing. That was because we were investing in people. We were investing in education. We were investing in the right skills, right? But look at, from 1982, our per capita income also started reducing. In all the 80 countries that we surveyed, no country ever reduced education expenditure for more than 3-4 years maximum. We reduced in 30 years. 30 years. So you can now see why everybody's running abroad to school, right? So, what we did is to compare Nigeria with other countries and see where we are. This is Chile, South America. If you look at the education expenditure, I don't know if it's that clear. Chile, in 44 years, we took from 1970 to 2014. Chile, in 44 years, have invested 120.5 billion in education. Nigeria has only invested 48 billion. Chile has a population of 17.8 million people, 10% of our population. And you can see, as they increase education expenditure, right, their per capita income, this is the per capita income. Chile has a better per capita income than us because they are arming people with the right what? The right education and the right skills. The next, that's the per capita income of Chile compared to Nigeria. The next is Brazil. Brazil, with a population of 206 million people, have invested $1.5 trillion in 44 years. Nigeria has only invested 48 billion. You can see the per capita income, the disparities in per capita income. The next one is Mexico. Mexico, with a population of 125 million people, as in 2014, we used 2014 because all data were updated to 2014. Mexico, by 2014, in 44 years, have spent or invested 882 billion on education, compared to Nigeria with 178 million people that have only invested 48 billion. And you can see the income disparity between Mexico and Nigeria. Canada, with a population of only 35 million people, have spent $1.6 trillion that they've invested on their people in 44 years, compared to Nigeria, 48. You can also see the income disparities between Canada and Nigeria. These are the developed world, right? From Canada upward, I'm going to be discussing the developed world. Now, this is the United States. Now, I know why you're shouting. See, this is the reason why everybody goes to the US. This is the reason why everybody wants to go to the US. In 2014 alone, the US invested 900 billion. 900 billion in education. You see why all the innovations are coming out from the US, right? They are investing in their people. And that was why in the previous slides, right? They said all African nations only accounted for 1% of all the what? Patented products that came out from the US in year 2000. That's the US. In 44 years, the US has invested 17.16 trillion. We go to United Kingdom. I'm just going to breeze through this, right? United Kingdom have invested 2.7 trillion in 44 years. And that's their GDP per capita. Germany has invested $3.5 trillion on education investment in 44 years. And that's their GDP per capita, as the income disparity is shown compared to that of Nigeria. Australia has invested $950 billion in 44 years compared to Nigeria. But the interesting thing is that when we got to countries like Egypt, right? I want you to look at the graph. Now, you see that the blue line, right, was ahead in the 70s. There was a time we had South Africans, East Africans, West Africans, North Africans, even the Arab nations, right, come to study. This was the time when the government was investing in us. When the government gave us good education, pumped money in education. By 1981, right, Nigeria had reached $3 billion in education expenditure, compared to Egypt that year at 717. We were ahead. We were ahead. But look at the graph. Egypt remained on course. They did not reduce it. And by 2014, Egypt had reached an all-time high of 12.97 billion, compared to Nigeria at 4.6 billion that year. And then when you look at the next slide, you see that Egypt has overtaken us in per capita income. That is why we are now going to Egypt today to school. Now, but the interesting thing is, we now saw that Egypt's per capita income, the disparity was not that wide. So what were they doing wrong? We went into their budget and the country as a whole and the economy. And what we found out was interesting. Egypt is the 12th largest country in Africa. But 90% of Egyptian land is what? Desert. 90 million people only live on 10% of the land in the northeast, city of Alexandria, Cairo, Port Said, and the cities along the Nile. Egypt is an economically disadvantaged country compared to Nigeria. But what Egypt has done, they know that the knowledge-based economy, right, is the future. So they started pumping money into developing people, education. And it has paid off today. South Africa, or let me go back to Egypt. In 44 years, Egypt has spent 148 billion on education, compared to Nigeria, 48 billion. Then, South Africa, in 44 years, has spent 354 billion on education, compared to Nigeria. But when we now went into the Asian countries, if you look at the blue mark, right, we were ahead of the Asian countries in the 70s. And that was because we were heavily investing in education. Countries like Thailand were behind us. But look at Thailand today. Thailand has reached 18 points. In 2014, right, they had upped their education expenditure and reached an all-time high of 18.69 billion, compared to Nigeria at 4.6 billion. And in 44 years, Thailand has spent 208 billion, compared to Nigeria, 48 billion. And then, if you look at the income, it also shows. But if you look at the graph, right, in 1981, our per capita income was far way ahead of Thailand. But today they are ahead of us because they invest in their people. Indonesia, the same thing. Indonesia, in 1981, was investing less than us, and our per capita income was better. But today, in 2014, rather, Indonesia reached an all-time high of 26.25 billion in education expenditure, compared to Nigeria at 4.6. So, in the per capita income too, you can see. But when we also looked at Indonesia, the per capita income is not that wide. Imagine. And we went back into the budget and found out, if you look at Indonesia, right, they also abandoned education for a long time. It wasn't until 1998 before they started investing in human capital development. And it started paying off. So, Malaysia, the same thing. And then, we now looked at education expenditure over the last 44 years, compared to population and what we have invested. Brazil is 116% of our population, but we've only invested 3.2% of what they've invested. Chile is only 10% of our population, but we've only invested 40.5% of what they've invested in education. Mexico is only 70% of our population, and we've only invested 5.5% of what they've invested in education. Canada is only 20% of our population, and we've only invested 3.1% of what they've invested in education. Germany, the United Kingdom is 36.3% of our population. We've only invested 1.78% of what they've invested in education. Germany, we've only invested 1.36% of what they've invested. Australia, we've only invested 5% of what they've invested in education. Egypt is 50.3% of our population. We've only invested 32.9% of what they've invested in education. Thailand is 38% of our population. We've only invested 22.3% of what they invested in education. Indonesia is 143% of our population. We've only invested 21.9% of what they've invested in education. Malaysia is only 16.8% of our population, and we've only invested 24.8% of what they've invested in education. Is education an expense or an investment? It's an investment, right? So are we treating it as an investment? Let us look at the next slide. Now, Nigeria, right? If you want to know whether something is an investment or an expense, right? An expense increase in proportion to whatever you are paying for. For instance, you're an employer, right? You have 10 employees. You treat them to lunch every day at 500 naira per plate. That means your daily expense on lunch is how much? 5,000 naira. The day your employees increase to 20, what happens? You know your daily expense is what? 10,000, right? Let us look at it. Now, Nigeria has increased by 135% from that 1981. Why 1981? 1981 was when we reached our peak in education investment. From 1981 to present date, we've increased by 135%. But our education investment has only increased by 53.6%. Brazil has only increased in population by 65%. But education investment has what? Increased by 1,041%. Chile has increased by 56%. And education investment has increased by 606%. But let us go, United States, 338%, United Kingdom, 470%, Germany, 461%, Australia, 650%. Now, this is the Egypt. Egypt has increased by 101.5%, but education expenditure has increased by what? 1,709%. The opposite of what happened between 1970 and 1981. Between 1970, Nigeria's education investment increased by over 1,500%. That was why we had Egyptians coming to Nigeria to school at that period. But right now, our education investment is increasing by 53%, and Egyptians' education investment is increasing by what? 1,709%. You see the opposite, right? Is now happening, and that's why we're going to their country. Thailand increased by 2,625%, but only increased with 40% in population. Indonesia increased with 68.5% in population and increased by 2,469%. Malaysia increased by 101% in population and increased by 1,373. Now, you see why things are happening in Asia, right? The Asian economies now know that the future belongs to what? Knowledge-based economy. These were things that they were not even practicing in the 60s and 70s. And we that were practicing them, we left them behind and decided to what? So, let's go on. So, what have we learned? Education in Nigeria versus the world. Let's look at it. What is the economic consequences of our negligence? 1.5 million people sit for JAMB every year. Only what? 600,000 get admitted. 40% of the population. We have a huge market of 900,000. 60% that must look for admission elsewhere. It is a catastrophe. Now, and as they look for this admission, mind you, it is the kids from the Green Springs, the Grange, the Avicennia, the American International School, the Loyola Jesuits that are going abroad. That means that it is the kids, the best brains that we have, right, that are going abroad. But if we are losing those best brains, right, what does it cost us every year? It costs us about, in 2012, an international magazine reported that Nigeria spent 1.5 trillion naira that year. Using the exchange rate of that period, it was about $10 billion. So, in cash, right, the country is losing about $10 billion annually because of education abroad, in both school fees and upkeep of our children. But the thing is this, what are we really losing as an intangible assets? For instance, if you want to sell a company, right, they come and value the company. But the intangible assets of the country, the company is what you base the value of the company on, plus the tangible assets. So you could have a company that is worth 20 billion, but the intangible asset is worth another 20 billion, right? These kids that we are sending abroad that are not coming back could be costing us as much as another 10, 15 billion in intangible assets every year. So, is it just to create wealth, get out of recession? If we create wealth, right, there's a principle in economics that once you get richer, import increases. Education, when you go outside the country to school, is actually recorded as an import, right? Because you're taking funds out of the country. Is it just to create wealth? The solution is not just to get out of recession. The solution is for the government, right, to train you and I, to arm you and I with the right standard of education and the right skills. If we do that, if the government does that, right, what happens is they reduce the number of people going abroad. We create a market that other people can come into Nigeria to also school. But the interesting thing is this. Between year 2000 and 2010, wealth was created in this country. And as wealth was created, 71 Nigerian students abroad increased by 71%. So getting out of recession is not the solution. We must fix the system. We must fix the educational system. So we look at the foreign strategy and our ignorance. The truth is, the foreign schools, right, or the foreign governments, they have our data. And why did I say that? I'll read something to you. In February 2015, the ICF Monitor reported that the British Council had projected that Nigeria would lead the world in tertiary age population growth through 2024. The Council projected that population age between 18 to 24 years will grow from 16.1 million in 2013 to 22.5 million in 2024, representing an annual growth of 3.1%, surpassing that of China that will grow at minus 2.9% and India at 0.3%. They know that we do not have the facilities. They know that our population is growing. They know, they see the population expenditure that we are not meeting up with what? UN regulations, right? And that is why all the recruitment agencies have flooded Nigeria. And the other ignorance, right? We have the British schools here, we have the American schools here that are practicing their curriculum. What do you think will happen? And then, every year, what never happened in the 70s or 60s, now a whole class goes to UK, they go to France, they are going to South Africa for excursion. What do you think they are doing? They are psychologically preparing these kids. They are psychologically preparing them to school abroad. Most of these kids, when they come back, they start to tell their parents, it is Britain I want to go to for university. It is France I want to go to, or it is the US I want to go to. And we are the ones, at the end of the day, doing what? We are the ones losing. It is putting a strain on our economy. So, but the thing is this. Is it wrong to go school abroad? It is not wrong, right? You cannot control people's choices, but you can influence it. And how can you influence people's choices? By giving them a better services. Right? When you give them better services, you influence their choices. But the thing is this. You see, the global education market, right? Countries have built education into a massive industry. It is not just a learning place anymore. And in 2012, right, it was reported that the global education market was worth $4.4 trillion. And that it will grow by 23% by end of 2017 to 5.41 trillion. But the question is this: what is Nigeria's share in this market? Let's look at the United States, right? United States also have students outside the country, with respect that they also have students within the country. But the United States has a trade surplus in education, right, of over 450,000 students. The United Kingdom has a trade surplus of over 460,000 students. Canada has a trade surplus of over 300,000 students. South Africa has a trade surplus of over 64,000 students. Egypt has a trade surplus of over 29,000 students. The question is this: who are those coming to Nigeria to school? Who are those coming to Nigeria to school? Who are those bringing dollars into this economy to pay us in dollars to go to our schools? So, the next graph, right, is Nigeria compared to the world. This is our population. We have removed, what we did was to remove the United States, because the United States was an outlier in this case. At 17.16 trillion education expenditure in 44 years, dwarfed every other country. So we removed the United States, right? But you see, Nigeria, the only two countries that surpass Nigeria is Indonesia and Brazil in population. But the interesting thing is this: when we now plotted in the education expenditure, look at where Nigeria is. The graph refused to take off from the ground. Nigeria is on the extreme. But you see, but you can see where the problem is, right? Look at the population. Look at the other countries that are less populated, right? But when you put in the education expenditure, look at where Nigeria is. So, but we looked at it, we said, okay, fine. Germany, Canada, United States, Germany, and Australia are OECD countries that are referred to as the developed economy. Okay, let us remove them and compare Nigeria to developing economies. And this was what we still came up with. We are not investing in human capital development. Education is the right of a child. The schools, I always tell people, if you want to know how bad the situation is, go back to this primary school you went to and see if one single classroom has been added. Then calculate how many years ago you went to that school, right? What the population was at that particular time and what the population is today. And then look at the infrastructure. Look at the infrastructure decay. So, recommendations. What do? We must increase education expenditure. We must start to increase it. Look, it is the future. It is a future disaster if we decide not to do what needs to be done. Education must be treated as an investment. We should look at the value chain of education, right? And say, okay, look, if we put in 10 billion yearly or 15 billion, what do we expect back in return? It should be that we bring in finance experts, because we cannot have a population of 180 million people and not put them to use. We must develop skill acquisition centers. What do I mean? It doesn't just stop with education. It doesn't just stop with just people graduating. The countries that invest the highest in education also provide the necessary skills for the people, or for the people to succeed after they leave school. And it's part of the education budget yearly. Building on existing infrastructures. We have these schools, right? All we need to do is start to fix them and increase their value to a certain level that we can boast of outside this country. We must build roads, build rail lines, build good infrastructures that will promote business. Why? Because infrastructure is what attracts industry to absorb what? The graduates. A lot of people who school outside this country, right, who have good ideas, refuse to come back because there are no infrastructures to promote their idea. So government must also provide that infrastructure. Then government must give grants to graduates from skill acquisition centers to start manufacturing. Now, this is the model the Asian countries used, right? They send you to a skill acquisition center, or you go to a skill acquisition center yourself. By the time you graduate, right, government gives you low interest rate loans, right, that you can use to set up some manufacturing center. A small-scale industry that you can employ between 5 to 10 people. And this will also serve as an incentive. It is not everybody that must go to university. If we have skill acquisition centers that measure up to international standards, and people know that government will give them grants when they finish, a lot of people will rather go to these skill acquisition centers. And then, in the book, The End of Poverty, Professor Jeffrey Sachs said something. He said, education plus health plus infrastructure plus free market equals what? Unlimited potential growth. He never said anything about mineral resources. The human resources, right? The human capital we have in this country can rule over the whole of Africa if we start manufacturing. And the good thing is that if you look at the Nigerian map, or the world map, has anybody ever spread out the world map to look at the critical location of Nigeria? God really blessed this country. We are the only country in the world, right? Geographically. When you have your spare time, go look at what I'm talking about. Nigeria is like the country in the center of the world. We are that heart of Africa, right? 6 hours up north to Europe, 6 hours down south to South Africa, 10, 12 hours to North America, 7, 8 hours to what? To South America, 6 hours to the Middle East, and another 13 hours. We are centrally placed. And the whole of the southern Nigeria is what? Is a seaport. There were countries that we used in this survey, countries like Paraguay, Bolivia, that do not have, they are landlocked. But the interesting thing is this: their per capita income is still greater than that of Nigeria. For Bolivia to get their goods out, right, they have to go through Chile and go through one of the most treacherous deserts in the world, the Atacama Desert. But guess what? Bolivia makes sure they meet that percentage in education. And the human capital is driving their economy. So, to close out, right? The United Nations said 26%. And the economists know that human capital is the greatest asset of any country. And human capital development, the greatest investment you can ever embark on. If we want to grow a sustainable economy, develop the people and see what happens. Research shows that no nation has ever survived sustainable economic growth and progress with the relegation of education. And we will not be an exception if we do not change course. I therefore plead that with the President and Vice President to formulate policies that will return Nigeria to the economic model of the 70s when we invested in human capital development. A friend sent me this 2 weeks ago, and I want to read it out to everyone. A university lecturer wrote an expressive message to his students at the doctorate, master's, and bachelor's levels and placed it at the college entrance in a university in South Africa. And this was the message: collapsing any nation does not require use of atomic bombs or the use of long-range missiles. It only requires lowering the quality of education and allowing cheating in the examinations by the students. The patient dies in the hands of the doctor who passed his exams through cheating. And the building collapses in the hands of an engineer who passed his exam through cheating. And the money is lost in the hands of an accountant who passed his exams through cheating. And humanity dies in the hands of a religious scholar who passed his exams through cheating. And justice is lost in the hands of a judge who passed his exams through cheating. And ignorance is rampant in the minds of children who are under the care of a teacher who passed their exams through cheating. The collapse of education is the collapse of a nation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that very thought-provoking and enlightening presentation. Thank you. Let's just wait for the last speaker to go. A round of applause, please, for he and the other speakers who have shared their thoughts today. Thank you very much. On that note, I'd like to say thank you to all of us who came from out of Lagos, those of us who are still here. Thank you very much, and happy Workers' Day. Bye.